Nigel, you hear
All
me?
right, Jonathan.
Okay. What could I say? Shoot away.
Okay. I'll read out a brief introduction and then I'll start shooting. Jonathan Rose is the William R. Kennan Professor of History at Drew University in New Jersey and one of the great book historians of our time. Not only has he done groundbreaking research in his field, he was also instrumental in founding the society within which book historians and scholars gather to discuss and share their work. SHARP. Jonathan, can you remind me what SHARP stands for again, please?
Yes, the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing.
Okay. And you delivered a paper to the society about a year ago entitled Readers Magazine's Playboy Market Research, the Daniel Starch Reports as a Tool for Reading Research.
Yes.
And that's what we're going to discuss today. Welcome once again to the Bibliophile.
Thank you so much for having me, Nigel.
Readership is an important area of study for you, isn't it?
Well, yes, because I was trained as an intellectual historian, but I had to confront the question of what real influence did all these great minds have on the masses of people. In other words, was it simply a question of a few elite white guys sort of talking to each other, or was there a really popular audience for their work? And that's what basically has been driving a lot of my research. To be honest, I find an account of a chambermaid reading Middlemarch more interesting than the novel itself.
Okay, so you mentioned the starch report. I wonder, is
Yes.
there any equivalent to that? And we'll get into what it is. It's basically measuring readership of magazines. But is there any equivalent of that for books?
Well, that I'm not sure. I haven't come across that. Daniel Starch was a pioneering advertising and public relations man. He wrote extensively about the issues of advertising. He had his own PR firm. And what they did in the sort of the middle of the 20th century is they would send investigators out to people's homes, thousands of them literally, and ask them, well, all kinds of, demographic information, how many people in the household, what's your income? Did you buy a television? Did you go traveling this year? And so on. And which magazines do you read? Okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because, of course, that'd be very valuable information for advertisers if they want to reach a particular audience.
This is
Yes.
what I want to get at.
Yes.
Is that it's really thanks to the fact that magazines were partially funded by advertising that we have this treasure trove of information
Of
that
course.
isn't available for books.
Well, that's exactly true. It's there have been some surveys, scholarly surveys done of book reading. They're very spotty. Interestingly enough, the people who did some of the best research on the reading of books were the Russians under the communists because they didn't have an independent literary marketplace. They didn't have independent book reviews. Everything was centrally planned. They had no way of knowing the kind of books people wanted to read unless they actually went out and surveyed them. And of course, they also wanted to know if they're reading ideologically correct books. So, in fact, if you allow for their ideological biases, these Russian surveys are really very, very revealing. Okay.
Mm.
In America, of course, all this is done by capitalism. That's what drove the reports, and they provide very detailed, granular information about the people who read not just Playboy in this case, which I'm researching, but all the major magazines. And of course, it's a question of with magazines, we don't just want to know what their sales were or who bought them. We want to know who's reading them because many people who don't actually buy a magazine read it
Yeah.
nevertheless. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. The pass along. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And in this case, Playboy happened to have one of the highest rates, pass along rates of any magazine ever published for obvious
Right.
reasons. There's also the reverse case. Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time sold enormously in terms, but apparently almost nobody read it.
Yes, yeah.
It was sort of a prestige book to have on your shelf. Right.
So the real measure, or one of the few measures of the sort of impact or reach of books, is just simply the number of copies sold and the revenues of the publishers.
Right. And sometimes we have that information and sometimes we don't. But again, just the sheer number of copies sold, or for that matter, the number doesn't directly tell us whether it's being read or not.
No, no.
We really need more direct kind of information about that,
Mhm.
and that
Yeah.
is what the Starch reports do provide.
For magazines, though,
That is true.
they didn't do any work on books then.
Not that I know of, but
Yeah.
maybe it's in their archives somewhere. There is a survey of that. In general, they were a marketing firm, and they're still around, although I think they were absorbed by some conglomerate. Arguably, in their archives, they've got some kind of copies, except, of course, they don't like sharing it with scholars. This is rather confidential business information. So what I
Mm,
had to do was to try to track down copies that were languishing in university libraries all over the country, and gradually was able to work through them.
right. So what you do here is you identify these starch reports as information. It's an information rich resource, and then you in the paper provide examples of how this research can kind of correct the record or correct interpretations of the impact of Playboy in particular.
Right. And in particular, what it shows is that Playboy had an enormous female readership, which of course is counterintuitive, isn't it? But I roughly estimate, going on these starts reports, that it had roughly one third of their readers were female. Okay. Even though very few of the people who purchased the magazine were of course women. But what they would do is, women would snatch the magazine out of their hands of their boyfriends or husbands or sons and so on, and found that they very much enjoyed it, contrary to what many feminists said. There were some women, obviously, who found Playboy exploitive and so on, and sexist. I would say that they were a rather noisy and small minority. I think for the most part, most women who actually read the magazine were very taken by it and read it, in fact, as a feminist magazine. Found it all very, very emancipating.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It's you talk about these co-eds at Iowa State Teachers College devouring Playboy precisely because, in their view, quote, it exploded demeaning and oppressive stereotypes about women. And yet that's exactly the criticism that
Mm-hmm.
feminists and others have pointed at the magazine, isn't it?
Well, yes, and I don't just use the Starch reports because, of course, they don't tell me why these women were reading it. What I
Right.
do is I go back to the letters to the editor to Playboy, many of which are written by women. It
Yeah.
means, of course, that I've had to read through every back issue of Playboy. It's a tough, dirty job, but somebody has to do it. This is that I remember that letter. That was 1954, and there was this enormous women's dormitory at Iowa State College, and they said everybody is reading the magazine. They're passing it around, and they like it because we don't like the stereotype of a school teacher being a old maid with glasses and a bun in her hair. We are fascinated by, among other things, their coverage of European films, which, of course, in 1954 they could show female nudity in European films. So they had to be cut out when they were shown in America. And what
Yeah.
Playboy would do is they would have still photos of some of the scenes that were cut out. And of course,
Mhm.
these young women found it absolutely fascinating and very liberating. They had grown up in rather conservative, small Midwestern towns, and this was very eye-opening to them.
I mean, the attitude towards sex in the United States is just so hypocritical. It's ridiculous.
I
It
think we
always has been.
Yes, I think we really we can't treat the subject as adults. Either we are repressed and puritanical, or we're leering and salacious. I think for those who actually read Playboy, realized that it was a they were opposed to both of those extremes, and felt that the subject should be handled like adults, without a lot of arbitrary restrictions, and with some intelligence. And by the way, one of the most popular columns in Playboy was so-called Playboy Advisor. It was an advice column. It would offer advice about, what kind of cravat to wear to a dinner party and what kind of wine to serve, and also, of course, about sex.
Mm-hmm.
20% of all the queries about sex were sent in by women. This is the 1960s, when Ladies' Home Journal was not going to address these kinds of questions. So you begin to
Mm-hmm.
see why they found the magazine attractive.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, the basic advice that Playboy would give to women about sex was whatever works for you. Okay, it's very non-judgmental. I recall one woman who wrote in and said, "Is there something wrong with me? I can only climax when I'm on top." And Playboy wrote back, "Tell your husband to lie back and enjoy it."
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not prescriptive then.
No, except of course that there were certain rules, but among others, Playboy was always insisted on consensual sex from the very
Right.
beginning.
Right.
They kept drumming that into the heads of their readers. They said that you have to treat your partner with respect, always. Okay. You can't, they told men outright, you can't expect a woman just to jump into bed with you. You have
Yeah.
to first establish a relationship, an intellectual rapport, and then, that a more romantic relationship would probably follow from that. But one of the reasons they published, they had so much intellectual content in Playboy. They had, interviews with Bertrand Russell and fiction by Ray Bradbury and so on, is that they wanted to give its readers a cultural background that they could then discuss with the women in their lives and make them feel that they were not just interested in their bodies, they're also interested very much in their minds. And women did appreciate that very much so. In fact, one of them wrote in and said, "Playboy is the only magazine that recognizes I have both a body and a mind."
It's interesting. I mean, I've spent more than 10 years interviewing people about books, and just in the last couple of years, I've just become crazy for magazines.
Well, and you should, because that's people spend a lot of their time reading magazines, not just books.
Well,
And
yes, and this is my question for you,
yes,
Jonathan. I mean, you're a renowned book scholar. What's your take on magazines?
I think that their influence is underestimated. They can really determine the terms of national discourse, what are important issues. And one of the
Hmm.
most famous examples was, John F. Kennedy would give regular news conferences. One reporter once asked him, has the people of the Department of Agriculture read A Silent Spring, by Rachel Carson? He said, well, yes, and are they doing anything about it? And he said, "Well, yes, in fact, we have read it, and we are taking a great interest in it, and looking at our policies accordingly." 2 points. First of all, the people in the Department of Agriculture hated Rachel Carson because she was very critical of government programs, that were using very heavy amounts of insecticide. And secondly, Kennedy had not read the book Sound Spring. He had read it in the New Yorker magazine. It was first serialized there. The book itself actually hadn't been published yet in book form. That was an enormous plug for Rachel Carson, and it sent the book into the bestseller list, and of course, made it part of the nation's agenda, and that was the real launch of the modern environmental movement.
It's interesting you mentioned Kennedy. He was an Ian Fleming fan, and Fleming was serialized in Playboy before some of the novels came out.
Certainly Playboy did publish Ian Fleming, and even there, that apparently had appealed to a lot of female readers because, well, who was the predecessor of Ian Fleming and James Bond? It was Mickey Spillane and Mike Hammer.
That's
That was,
the Saint as well. It's the
that's
Saint.
true. That's true. The Saint, however, was a more, genteel kind of character. But the bestseller in the 1950s was Mickey Spillane. Mike Hammer is a very different character from James Bond. He's an ape. He's a brute. He's illiterate. He abuses women. He kills women. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And that was noticed at the time. And then you see a transition to James Bond, who is a gentleman, okay,
yeah.
who rescues women from supervillains, And then, of course, it treats them to delicious sex as well. So that had much more appeal for female readers.
Well, it's also, I mean, you might say that he's the ideal Playboy reader. They advertise.
Exactly, exactly. That was the fantasy figure. But Playboy. Yes, there were a few articles about the Playboy Mansion and the sort of fantasy life there, but for the most part, the kinds of luxuries that Playboy promoted were affordable to the middle class. We're talking about plays and nightclubs and swanky restaurants
Mhm.
and vacations in Paris and so on. So it was not it was not so much fantasy. It was something that
No.
could actually be achieved by the readers. And women also decided to, copy the modernist decor that Playboy very much promoted.
Yeah. Well, in fact, this is just another example of a kind of a myth or a sort of bullshit that was spread about Playboy. You're
Right.
debunking a lot of this.
Well, I think most of the critics of Playboy hadn't read it. We find in the history of censorship, this is a very common phenomenon. The people who demand that these be censored have not actually read what they want to suppress, maybe because
Right.
they feel it's so dirty that they'll be contaminated
Right.
if they read it. Even in the feminist critiques of Playboy, they really very rarely do they discuss what's actually in the magazine. So you have
Yeah.
to question: did they actually read? Did they actually read it?
Yeah. I just want to get back to the sort of the impact of magazines versus books. I mean,
Yes.
maybe a book's impact is longer lasting because they go into multiple printings, they don't go out of print. But
Mm-hmm.
seems to me, you talk about the gigantic number of readers for Playboy in the early 70s. It's like 15 or 20 million.
Yes.
I
Of
just,
which more than 5 million were women. Yes, right.
right. So what do you think? Do you think that magazines have greater impact than books or not?
I think in many ways they do because you usually read a book once, and
Right.
a magazine is a relatively standardized product. We know
Uh-huh.
what to expect from Playboy or Ms. Magazine or Cosmopolitan or the New Republic or the National Review and so on. We'll supply that every month. And over the long term, that can certainly be a very profound influence, okay? Because the messages are constantly reinforced over
Yeah.
a period of several years. Another magazine that I think that we is underestimated is Cosmopolitan, which did send a rather similar message to women that Playboy sent to men. That is
Yeah.
one of the most successful magazines ever. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
They have editions now in almost 100 countries, including Mongolia. You sort of wonder what the Mongolian Cosmo publishes. I mean, the aphrodisiac qualities of yak milk. I don't know, and one of the first Western magazines to publish an edition in Russia was, in fact, after the fall of communism, was Cosmopolitan, and that too, there too, it achieved a huge circulation.
I mean, Playboy, you reference some of its positions, political positions,
Yes,
and it's very, very progressive. Abortion, anti-Vietnam. There's a whole string of really impressive positions that they take.
that's another reason why many liberal women read it for the politics. And yes, they did favor legalized abortion. They were opposed to the Vietnam War. It was the first major magazine to endorse gay rights. This is back in the 1960s. They were way ahead of the curve on that. They were able to not only endorse these positions but reach a mass audience. Playboy taking on the issue of gay rights, which was several years before the Stonewall, incident. That's influential
Yeah,
as the Stonewall incident because you have to consider not just these. Well, Stonewall was sort of like a gay fall of the Bastille. I mean, it was a big, a very dramatic event. For that, there was a lot of intellectual preparation. There was a lot of criticism of, sexual policy. Playboy was part of that. In fact, was indispensable in that kind of ferment. So I think it's the the contribution it made should be more widely recognized.
Yeah, I mean, civil rights is another example, and the fact that you mentioned that while the readership wasn't huge, I think it caught up to the black population in the United
Yeah.
States. It was the equivalent of that in the readership, which is far ahead of most other magazines.
Right. It had one of the largest black readerships of any mainstream magazine, and that was consistent. It from the very start covered jazz performers, singers, actresses. There was a very early profile of Eartha Kitt, which portrayed her not as a sex pot; it portrayed her as a hardworking professional who was very versatile, who could be a dramatic actress. And of course, by the 1960s, they explicitly were supporting the civil rights movement. So it had a very loyal black readership.
You mentioned the hugely controversial interview with Malcolm X.
Yes. And that was conducted by Alex Haley, who conducted many of the Playboy interviews. And of course, later he sort of, co-wrote the autobiography of Malcolm X, with and they put it into book form. There were some editors who didn't want to run that. And Playboy said, look, we're not endorsing what Malcolm X says, but we think our readers are adults. They can read what he has to say and make up their own minds about that. And we very much believe in free speech and free expression. And this was a time when, 1963, the mainstream press was very middle of the road, sought consensus, didn't really give a lot of play to the bomb throwers and the iconoclasts and so on. But Playboy did. And many women especially read it precisely because they could read these dissident voices, whether they agreed with them or not. And that, I think, is, if I may say so, is something I think we've lost. I think we have a reading public now which only wants to hear its own prejudices reinforced. I mean, cable news will deliver, whether you're a liberal or conservative, it will deliver to you exactly the opinions you want to hear. Whereas Playboy took the position, you should hear voices that are presenting very different points of view. And a lot of the readers really appreciated that, felt they were being treated like adults.
I interviewed John Sargent, head of Macmillan, some years ago. And that was exactly his philosophy. He published a book. Now I'm trying to remember if it was pro-Trump or anyway, he wanted to show both sides and felt that was one of the most important functions of the publisher.
Right. And talk about a little minor role in literary history that I played, and that was with Woody Allen's autobiography, Apropos of Nothing. And you may recall it was supposed to be published by Hachette.
Yes. And there was a big protest among the staff.
The staff and Hachette caved in.
Yeah.
And they had already had the first printing, and they pulped it all.
Yeah.
When I read about that, I contacted Tony Lyons, who was the head of Skyhorse Publishing, which is notable for publishing authors other publishers won't touch, like Alan Dershowitz and so on.
Yeah.
And I said, look, this is a golden opportunity for you. And I gave him the name of Woody Allen's literary agent. And 10 days later, Skyhorse published its own edition of Apropos of Nothing, a book, by the way, which I think is brilliant, and I highly recommend it.
This is what America is supposed to be about.
Well, isn't it? I would agree. Yes. And the thing is that, Woody Allen got to, I guess, keep his advance from Hachette, and then, of course, was able to take the book over to Skyhorse and make a killing on that. The publicity that surrounded the suppression of his book, of course, only in the long run boosted its sales.
Why do you think it's brilliant? Because it's an argument in favor of his innocence?
Yes. First of all, I do think he's innocent. I think he was framed. I think the evidence is overwhelming that these charges were completely groundless. That's part of it. In addition, it is it's a memoir of growing up with the movies, which were an enormous influence upon him, and I think discussion of that is very enlightening. And I have to say, even though obviously there's a lot of bad blood between him and Mia Farrow, he nevertheless acknowledges that she was a terrific actress and he's able to separate that from their domestic difficulties. And I think he is a real artist who appreciates other artists and wants to bring that to the screen.
Right. It's interesting again about magazines. They're more visually impressive than books.
Yes.
They involve the good ones, great
Mhm.
design and
Yeah.
photography. And in a way, because of that, combined with the words, you could argue that it's more memorable. It makes a greater impact on the reader.
Certainly, it's not just page after page of gray type. And in its first year, Playboy's winning awards for its graphic arts, and this was a magazine that originally, I mean, the first few issues, Hugh Hefner pasted together on his kitchen table. Later on, they had, of course, a more sophisticated operation. But I do think, in his own way, Hefner was an artist. He took meticulous care with every aspect of the magazine, bit of a control freak, in fact.
Mm,
But he wanted to create a certain image, and that's what he succeeded in doing.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned in an email to you that I bought a whack of Playboy. I got like 400 of them.
Yes,
But the reason that I bought them was because of the art director, Art Paul.
right.
As you say, the magazine is award winning for its design and throughout he was there, I think, until like 1982. He brought in great artists. He did all sorts of cool stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's just another reason to want to have the magazine.
I think it was very cleverly done. I can't think of a magazines today, frankly, that have that kind of innovative artwork.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean they used different kinds of paper, they had cutouts. Yeah, they did lots of interesting things. Well, just getting back to Daniel Starch, he understood that going out and asking a bunch of people questions, like was his focus to help publications sell more advertising or what?
Yes, yes, definitely, and
Yeah,
target their advertising.
right.
Reach. If a certain magazine attracts a lot of readers who travel outside the United States, and of course, the tourist industry is going to want to advertise there.
Right.
And in fact, he didn't want scholars like me looking at these reports because they should be purchased by private subscribers, i.e., the advertising agencies. And it was confidential business information, but it's also enormously useful to scholars.
Well, which obviously is this is an area that you're breaking ground in.
Yeah, I mean, just an example, they asked, did you buy a book in the last 12 months? Which obviously publishers want to know, right? Of all the magazines among women, Playboy had the highest rate of people who bought books, one of the highest anyway. And so, yes, obviously, women with literary interests did read it for the articles. Yes, they also looked at the pictures, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, I think women are just many of them are turned on by pictures of other women.
Well, there is the Kinsey report, and by the way, it's not there is no book called the Kinsey report. There were two reports, one in 1948, one in 1956, dealing
Uh-huh.
with the sexual behavior of first men and then 1953 women. And Hefner had read both of them religiously. And one of the questions that they asked of women was, what turns you on? Are you
Right.
turned on by pictures of naked men? No. Pictures of naked women? Yes. Pictures of
Interesting.
sharply dressed men? Yes. Now, Playboy, in addition to being, an intellectual girly magazine, was also a men's fashion magazine. So, in
Right.
fact, there was lots to look at in
Yeah.
this for women in this magazine. In addition, women generally found conversation very sexy. And one of their favorite features was the interviews, these very long interviews. They would comment about how sexy these guys were, even though The only photos were, three little postage stamp headshots. That's it of the interviewee. So it wasn't a visual thing. It was a literary thing. But certainly they found it in its own way a very sexy magazine.
Yeah. Well, and there's always sort of this age-old quest on the part of men and women to understand each other.
Right. And they felt that it was enlightening in that respect. But think of other factors as well. Most women's magazines are about recipes and
Mhm.
making yourself beautiful, which so many women enjoy. Other women find it a chore. Okay. There is nothing about making yourself beautiful in Playboy. Okay. There's nothing for cosmetics, nothing for women's fashions. There is no discussion of child rearing in it.
Maybe they want to escape
Well,
that.
exactly, that's what I'm thinking. And there was a food and drink column, but it was addressed to men, how men should arrange gourmet meals for the ladies in their life. Well, this was a very nice change as far as many women were concerned. You can see why this appealed to them. Yeah.
Yeah. Man, I mean, Hugh Hefner's coming off like really well here.
I think a lot his negative image is in part, in fact, a factor of how we last remember him when he was an elderly roue cavorting with women who were young enough to be his granddaughters, if not his great granddaughters. But that's not the way he was in the 1960s, when he was a dashing young man with a very sort of Kennedy esque appeal to it. He was very young and handsome and idealistic. And I think at that time, women found that very appealing.
Yeah, it's an interesting little point you make is that he got $1,000 or so. He started it up with 8,000, and he got $1,000 from his mom, and he got some money from his
Yeah.
brother or
Yeah.
sister.
His parents were Methodists, okay, in their own way rather puritanical, but they also believed, as it is part of the Methodist tradition, you think for yourself, you exercise your intellectual independence. So she felt, in spite of her feelings about the magazine, that she should back him in that. And so yes, she did put down some money, and she always told him, Huey, I was always hoping you'd become a missionary. And he said, but Mom, I am a missionary. And in a sense, he was preaching a gospel, a much more liberal version of Methodism without the Puritanism. But that was something that I think young Americans in the 50s and 60s were doing. They were not completely turning their backs on the religion of their parents, but they were promoting a more modern and more liberal version of it, whether they
Mhm.
were liberal Protestants, or Vatican II Catholics, or Reformed Jews, so on. They would try to bring their religion into sync with the modern world. And I think that's what Hefner was doing in many ways with Methodism.
Hmm. What else do you think he was trying to do?
I think that he was very patriotic. He
Mhm.
believed in America. He believed very much in the free enterprise system,
Mhm.
with the result that a lot of conservatives actually liked the magazine. Now, it tended to be, shall we say, the libertarian conservatives, which is to say those who believed that the government had no business regulating the bedroom or the boardroom. They were rather consistent in that respect, as opposed to more moral conservatives or Christian conservatives who were, much more censorious about that sort of thing. But by the early 2000s, Playboy had more Republican readers than Democratic readers. I'm not quite sure why it was, but I attribute that to the fact that he lost a lot of his old Democratic readers because more and more in those circles, Playboy is regarded as sexist and so on. But,
Yeah.
but amongst libertarian Republicans who resented to some extent the takeover of their party by the moral majority and so on, and the playmates were all these fresh-faced, wholesome, all-American girls. So yes, they found a home, so to speak, in Playboy.
Another interesting finding is that young women were reading it. So,
That's
it's like the future of.
the highest level of readership amongst women was among newlyweds, probably because they were reading their new husband's copy, and of course, they being newlyweds, they were probably at the peak of their sexual activity, and they found this all very liberating. It was an expression of togetherness, so to speak. She and her husband were both reading this magazine. By the
Mm.
way, this is a common pattern we observe in the consumption of pornography. If men consume it alone, then their wives can feel very resentful. But if a couple views it together, then it's far more acceptable to them, and in fact tends to bring them together. So I think that was what was operating there. And yes, in the early 1970s, okay, Playgirl magazine, which of course published pictures of nude men, quickly achieved a circulation of 2 million, and they were mostly women. It was at least not at that point gay men. Cosmopolitan had a million and a half. This is after the Burt Reynolds, centerfold. And Ms. Magazine had only 300,000. In terms of that measurement, again, I think that the feminists who criticized Playboy were generally in the minority, even among young women, and a much larger number were very much approving of what Playboy was doing.
It's funny looking at some of the Playboys that I bought, the centerfolds. I didn't find it terribly exciting. I thought all of this airbrushing was kind of fake. What's your take on that?
Well, it's certainly a matter of personal taste, put it that way. But if they had not airbrushed it to defend them, first of all, then the censors would have come down very hard on them. And Playboy did have to sort of navigate that Scylla and Charybdis without, they wanted to be in the convenience stores, they wanted it to be on the newsstands, and if they went too far, too explicit, that might get them into trouble. In addition,
Right.
I think that Hefner generally disliked sex that was too raw.
Too real, you mean?
Well, all right, not necessarily too real. I think realism he very much was in favor of, but if it was exploitive, then I think he was very much put off by that.
Mm,
He did not consider Playboy to be pornography, and indeed, if we define pornography as something that has no redeeming social value, as the Supreme Court would have put it, well, I
yeah.
submit that interviews with Bertrand Russell and Malcolm X do have redeeming social value, and
Yeah.
fiction with Ray Bradbury and by Ray Bradbury and Joyce Carol Oates, who was a very who frequently published in Playboy, and when in the 1970s, the X-rated movies finally broke through, Deep Throat and so on, Playboy was actually very disappointed in them. They felt this was crude. They had been hoping for something more like Lady Chatterley's Lover, which of course is a beautifully lyric work of English prose, in addition, of course, to being very sexually explicit. And they found that the outpouring of pornography was much cruder than they had hoped for. And so, in fact,
Mhm.
they were very critical of that.
What about the relationship with Penthouse then? I mean, Penthouse is not quite so airbrushed, right?
True, true.
And yet what? They still were allowed to be on the grocery shop shelves?
Well, if they actually by the 1980s were getting into trouble with that because the Reagan administration, of course, was campaigning against pornography. John Ashbrook, the attorney general, was taking action against it, and they did pressure stores into dropping, not stocking both Playboy and Penthouse, and they certainly both suffered as a result. Penthouse was, yeah, they would show genitalia, they would and so on, and for a while Playboy felt they had to compete with that, but ultimately Hefner decided no, it was a race to the bottom.
So to
Yeah,
speak. Yeah.
exactly, and we're not going to go there. And I think that Penthouse never quite succeeded in exceeding Playboy in circulation, which was their goal. In addition, Penthouse had fewer women reading it, 20% as opposed to like one third in the case of Playboy. And
Yeah.
also, the women who read Penthouse, and I found some start surveys about that as well, were less educated than Playboy.
Right.
If the man in the house subscribed to Playboy, the woman, the wife, was more likely to read it if she had a college degree than if she had an eighth grade education. It's a very clear, correlation there.
Right.
So it appealed to, I think, a much more educated audience.
Incidentally, was Guccione British? No.
He worked for a while in Britain.
Right.
And then brought his ideas over to America. I don't believe he was actually British.
No, okay. And then of course there's Hustler.
Well, okay, that was just totally dirty and just disgusting in
Yeah,
general. But I
yeah,
think what happened is a lot of critics of Playboy sort of lumped it together with Penthouse and Hustler, when in fact they were very different magazines
right,
with
right.
very different approaches. Yeah.
Okay. So what's your big takeaway from all of the leafing through Playboys that you've done?
Well, in some ways, it was a fascinating return to my own memories. I was never a reader of Playboy. I may flip through somebody's, others' copy, but in fact, I wasn't a regular reader, which I think was a plus because when I just embarked on this project, I could then read it with fresh eyes without any
Right.
preconceptions, and it was very pleasantly surprised what I found. But in another way, reading through Playboy, I relived the whole cultural history era in which I grew up. We were
Yeah,
born almost at the same time, okay?
yeah,
And I suddenly recalled the authors I had read and the controversies that embroiled the country, and the films and so on, the television shows that were discussed. And yes, you are reliving your own history. That's what I found absolutely fascinating about it all.
right. What do you think were the best features in the magazine?
I think that the certainly the interviews, which I think are just classic. The fact that they were like 10,000 words.
Yes, I know. I interviewed Larry Grobel, who's one of the a bit later on, but he conducted a number of Playboy interviews, including the one where he actually went to Marlon Brando's island for
Yeah,
again for
yeah,
like a week.
right. They were very in depth, and there was no punches pulled, and it wasn't they weren't most of the interviews we now see in gossip magazines are basically written by their PR agents,
Yeah, yeah, it's bullshit. Yeah,
but these were very, very frank. That was fascinating. I think their cartoons, certainly the women loved the cartoons because though they were obviously sexy and salacious, yes, they were also very clever. It showed that you could have dirty jokes which are also very intelligent. Yeah, I think that made it acceptable for women to enjoy that kind of humor.
yeah, but they can also laugh at stuff that's just dirty. There's nothing wrong with that.
Well, I mean, we've been laughing at things that are dirty ever since Aristophanes and Chaucer. So, yes, I mean, sex by its very nature is funny.
Yeah,
Even the missionary position as a term is a joke.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So what about the future of your like are you like me? Are you gonna bail? I'm not bailing on books. No, I'm not doing that. But I'm enamored with magazines in a
Mhm.
way that I haven't been in the past. What about you?
I think that unfortunately, I mean, the magazine is almost a dying breed. And it's certainly the ink and paper magazine.
Well, I
Uh,
should say the mass circulation magazine, I'd agree, but there's
mhm.
quite a flourishing of small circulation, beautiful magazines out there now.
Online magazines, yes.
No, no, I'm talking about print. I'm
Oh, print
talking
magazine.
about print.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
maybe, like two, three, 4,000 run versus the millions.
Well, that's fine, but the question is, what kind of influence are they going to have?
That's
It
a criteria for you, is you obviously you
is. It
want
is.
you need to examine something that has a big impact on society.
If in the 20th century, what was distinctive about it is if a magazine ran a controversial article, that issue was placed on the nation's agenda. I mean, it started with Ida Tarbell and her expose of Standard Oil in
Yeah,
this magazine, which
yeah,
proved, by the way, you could do this kind of muckraking and build your circulation enormously. That continued throughout. I mean, or the New Yorker, which right after John Hersey's Hiroshima, which had published in 1946, right after the bomb had been dropped, and that certainly changed people's minds about nuclear weapons. I'm not sure there is any magazine today, that is, say, a print magazine,
Yeah.
can have that kind of impact. And it also has that kind of independence.
Yeah.
They are now largely owned by big conglomerates. That greatly limits their freedom of movement.
This is what I love about Esquire in the 60s. They were so bold.
Yes. And their covers, by the way, were incredibly innovative and bold. Yes.
Yes, George Lois. Yes.
Right, right. I just don't see any magazine engaging in that kind of daring. Let me put it that way.
Daring.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Honesty. Honesty.
Well, yes, exactly. Right.
What about you, though? Like as I said, I'm gaga about magazines. Are you gonna stay in the magazine, or are you gonna jump around and go back to books, or what?
That's a good question. Yeah, my next project, I'm not sure what that will be. I do want to get this one finished and out the door.
What does that entail, by the way?
Well, I'm writing it now. I mean, I've basically more or less completed the research, and so I'm now starting to put it all together. But it was a magazine that lasted for like almost 70 years, and
Yeah,
so it's a lot of ground to cover. And there's so many misconceptions to correct that on almost every page I'm going to be challenging conventional wisdom, shall we say, about the magazine, which is fun to do, I have to say.
Well,
I'm going to be feel very bereft when I finish writing it because it'll be just. But it does involve a lot of work. Yes.
so again, what form is this gonna? Do you have a publisher or what?
Let's just say I'm looking for one.
Okay, and you're not quite sure what you're gonna do next.
One of my ideas is I want to go back to George Orwell, an author I'm quite interested in. I want to treat him as a populist. I think in
Um,
many ways he anticipated the modern populist movement, and I know that populist readers love Orwell. And I saw at a political rally a poster, "Make 1984 Fiction Again." So I think that we can get a better understanding of what's happening in the populist movement, which is, it seems to be going from strength to strength, looking at the
yeah,
European elections just recently, by looking at someone who's arguably the intellectual father of that movement.
that's fascinating. I have such a negative opinion about populism and a positive opinion about George Orwell.
Well, there are many varieties of populism. It can be a left or a right movement to begin with.
Right, right.
And in fact, historians are not quite sure how to classify it because it has features of both. It may be a response to if conventional political parties are not responsive to certain popular demands, then you start to get a reaction populism. So I do think that while there are some disturbing tendencies in the populist movement here, you deal with that by trying to be more responsive
Yeah,
to grassroots voters. Otherwise, extreme politicians will step in into that
yeah.
vacuum. Yes.
It really is a protest, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, Jonathan, it's always a pleasure to talk with you and to listen to the way that you clarify history.
That's my job. But thank you, Nigel. I really enjoyed talking about this.
Very good. Jonathan Rose is, I'll just quickly repeat this here, the William R. Kennan Professor of History at Drew University, and he's looking for a publisher for this wonderful study of Playboy magazine.
Well, it doesn't have a publisher quite yet. That's what I'll say. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, okay. Well, thanks again for your time. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Nigel.
Okay, bye for now.